In 1943, a woman named Eleanor kept a small tin box on her kitchen shelf. Inside it, folded bits of string too short to use, buttons cut from shirts before they went to the rag pile, and a handful of nails straightened out and saved for later. She wasn't poor by the standards of her neighborhood. She was ordinary, and so was the tin box. Every house on her street had one. 60 years later, her granddaughter stood in a walk-in closet the size of Eleanor's entire kitchen, staring at 11 pairs of shoes she'd worn maybe twice each, wondering why she never seemed to have any money left by the middle of the month. Same bloodline, same country. Completely different relationship with money. And somewhere between that tin box and that walk-in closet, an entire philosophy of handling money quietly disappeared. Not because it stopped working, it disappeared because it stopped being convenient. This video is about what got erased, why it got erased, and how much it's costing you to live without it. Let's start with the single biggest shift, because it explains almost everything else that follows. The generation that lived through the Depression and the decades right after it operated on a rule that sounds almost primitive today. If you don't have the cash, you don't make the purchase. Not, you probably shouldn't. Not, try to avoid it. You simply didn't. Refrigerators were bought with money saved specifically for a refrigerator, sometimes over a year or two. A car was something you drove until it fell apart, then replaced in cash, with money you'd already set aside while driving the old one. This wasn't virtue. It was structural. Consumer credit as we know it barely existed until the 1950s and didn't become a mass, everyday tool until credit cards spread through the 1960s and 70s. An entire generation built their financial instincts in a world where spending money you didn't have simply wasn't an option on the table. And because it wasn't an option, they never developed the muscle for it, good or bad. They developed a different muscle instead, patience. That patience shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. It shows up in how they bought clothing. Fewer garments, better fabric, mended instead of replaced, worn until they were genuinely worn out. It shows up in how they bought appliances, chosen for how long they'd last rather than how they looked in the kitchen. It shows up in how they thought about a purchase at all. The question wasn't, can I afford the monthly payment? The question was, do I actually have this money right now, sitting in front of me? Two completely different filters. Only one of them keeps you out of debt. Here's the part that gets erased along with the practice. Waiting for something doesn't just protect your bank account. It changes how much you actually want the thing by the time you can afford it. Half of what modern buyers regret are impulse purchases made possible entirely by financing. Remove the financing, and a huge percentage of those purchases evaporate before they ever happen, because the desire fades faster than the saving does. Eleanor's generation didn't have willpower we've lost. They had a system that made the decision for them. We've built a system that does the opposite. The second thing that quietly disappeared is what you might call the repair instinct. A radio that stopped working got opened up and fixed, not thrown out. A pair of shoes went to a cobbler, not a landfill. Furniture got reglued, recaned, refinished, and handed down instead of curbside. This wasn't just frugality. It reflected a completely different relationship with the objects themselves. Things were expected to last a lifetime, sometimes multiple lifetimes, because they were built that way and treated that way. Compare that to now, where the average major appliance is designed with a shorter usable life than the one it replaced, where repair often costs nearly as much as replacement by design, and where an entire generation grew up assuming that when something breaks, you buy a new one. That shift alone represents thousands of dollars a year in purchases that previous generations simply never had to make because their possessions were built to be maintained rather than discarded. The third erased habit is harder to quantify, but arguably matters more than the first two combined. Nobody performed their finances for anyone. Wealth, when it existed, was often deliberately hidden rather than displayed. Farmers who owned their land outright drove the same battered truck for 20 years. Business owners who could have afforded much larger homes stayed in the same modest house for decades, because moving up was seen as showing off rather than something to aspire to. Status wasn't communicated through possessions. It was communicated through reputation, through reliability, through how a person treated their neighbors and paid their debts. That instinct has almost completely inverted. Now, A huge portion of spending exists purely to be seen. The car, the vacation photos, the renovated kitchen, the brand on the sweatshirt. None of it is really about the object. It's about the signal the object sends to other people. And signals are expensive to maintain because someone is always sending a slightly louder one. The generation that hid their wealth was, whether they realized it or not, protecting themselves from an arms race that never had a finish line. The generation that displays it has walked directly into that arms race and is now paying for it every single month. The fourth piece is the community safety net, and this is the one that's easiest to romanticize and hardest to actually reconstruct. Extended families often lived close together, sometimes under one roof across generations. Childcare, home repairs, even food during hard stretches moved between relatives and neighbors without any money changing hands. If someone lost work, someone else covered a meal or a mortgage payment for a month, with the understanding it would even out eventually. That web of informal, unpaid support functioned as insurance long before most people carried actual insurance. That web has thinned dramatically. Families are more spread out, more private about struggle, more likely to solve problems by spending money instead of asking for help, which means a slice of what earlier generations got for free, people now have to buy. Childcare, emergency cash reserves, occasional meals during a rough month. All of it now runs through a bank account instead of through a relationship, and all of it now has a price tag attached. Put those four things together: cash-only spending, repair over replacement, hidden rather than displayed wealth, and a tight informal safety net, and you get a completely different financial operating system than the one most people are running today. None of it required a higher income. Eleanor and her husband were not wealthy people. What they had was a set of defaults that made saving the path of least resistance and spending the thing that required deliberate effort. Today, for most people, that's flipped entirely. Spending is one tap away. Saving requires a decision, a setup, ongoing willpower. So, what does any of this actually look like if you tried to bring pieces of it back without pretending you can live in 1948? Start with the cash-only instinct, adapted for a world that barely uses cash anymore. Before any non-essential purchase over a set amount, wait. Not indefinitely, just long enough to separate the want from the impulse. A week is enough for most things. If you still want it in a week, buy it. Most of the time you won't. Bring back the repair instinct by asking one question before you replace anything. Has this actually stopped working, or has it just stopped feeling new? Those are two completely different problems, and only one of them costs money to solve. Reconsider what you're actually buying status for, not to eliminate nice things, but to notice which purchases are for you and which ones are, if you're honest, mostly for whoever might see them. That single distinction applied consistently changes an enormous amount of spending without changing your quality of life at all. And rebuild whatever version of the safety net is realistic for you. That might mean one honest conversation with family about helping each other through rough patches instead of everyone quietly struggling alone. It might mean a genuine emergency fund that plays the role the extended family used to play. The form matters less than the function. Something in place that isn't just your bank account standing alone against every problem life throws at it. None of this is about pretending the past was simple or that going back is possible. It wasn't simple, and you can't go back. But somewhere in the space between a tin box full of saved string and a closet full of shoes worn twice, something useful got left behind, along with everything that was genuinely worth leaving. Eleanor never had a savings app. She never needed one. She had a set of habits so ordinary to her that she probably never thought of them as financial strategy at all. They just were how you lived. That, more than any specific habit on this list, might be the thing worth trying to get back.